Hey guys, welcome back to another week of the Get to Know Me series. For being here today, That's right. And a spoiler on the intro there. Welcome back to another great episode of Get to Know, the show brought to you by the Salvation Army here in Berwick. And boy, we have a great guest this week. There are only a handful of people that I can kind of as mentors a different path in my life. And this gentleman coming in is one of those very people. He has an amazing job right now that we're going to learn all about as the Director of Communications for the United States Coast Guard Museum. Let's get to know Mr. Drew Forster. And let's bring him in right now. Drew, welcome to the show, sir.
How you doing, Captain Buzzard?
Oh, I am all right. It's been a few years since we've been able to interact. And so I probably should elaborate maybe a little bit on the whole mentor thing. This show probably in one way was rooted in Drew's pulling me aside very early on in my officership and walking alongside me as I learned how to communicate to the masses. And so, Drew, I can say publicly, thank you for that here for the first time.
Well, I definitely saw your potential in that, your passion for it, and then the fact that you were teachable. And so it was easy for me when I was the Director of Communications for the Salvation Army in Massachusetts to invest in you and in what you were doing in your community there in Athol, where my wife grew up. I mean, I think that did have part, it did have something to do with it. We're always invested in Athol, this little tiny central Massachusetts town, and so your love for those people definitely had made an impression on me, and so it was my pleasure to come alongside and help you tell great stories of what the Salvation Army was doing in that community, and it's exciting to see you do it here in Berwick as well.
Yeah, and Athol, for those that would probably say, where's Athol? Some people say, where's Berwick? And I've said before that if you were to pick up Berwick and put it in Massachusetts, and if you were to pick up Athol and put it in Pennsylvania, they're the same town. And we love them both. And so it was a great time. So, Drew, as you just elaborated a little bit on, we met while you were working for the Salvation Army as the Director of Communications in Massachusetts, a position that you held for quite a few years. And then you transitioned into the United States Coast Guard Museum. So I was hoping maybe as we start, tell us, what is the United States Coast Guard Museum and what does the Director of Communications do?
Sure. Well, yeah, I had worked for 19 years in the Salvation Army, and I am a lifelong Salvationist. And so it really was kind of home for me. And then a colleague of mine moved on to become the Director of Development at the National Coast Guard Museum Association, the 501c3 that is working alongside the Coast Guard to establish a national museum for the service. It's the only one of the legacy armed services that does not have a national museum. I have to say legacy armed services because obviously the Space Force does not have their museum yet. But I wasn't sure when I left the Salvation Army if I was going to be able to as passionately invest in telling the stories of another agency. And I have to say that I could not have chosen better than the Coast Guard. They are I see a lot of similarities actually between the Salvation Army and the Coast Guard. People feel like they know both organizations because of the public-facing nature of the Red Kettle campaign in the case of the Salvation Army, or the search and rescue efforts, or if anybody's a boater, those boating inspections that the Coast Guard Auxiliary do. People feel like they know these two organizations, but there's so much more to what they do than kind of meets the eye for the public. And then the other thing that I saw as a similarity is the absolute humility with which both the Salvation Army and the Coast Guard go about accomplishing these really complicated missions. It's not uncommon for me to talk to a coastie and they'll explain some incredible thing that they did, interdicting drugs, or helping migrants to find, a safe harbor, but also protecting our border in the maritime venue. And then they'll be like, yeah, and that was Tuesday. For them, it's just going to work. But they really do these incredible things. And so it's been my pleasure for the past 4 years to try to help this nonprofit tell the story of the Coast Guard and why the Coast Guard so richly deserves a national museum, just like all their peers.
Right, which is what was actually touched on in the video as we introduced you, was that dream of making that 5-tier museum a reality and giving the due to those brave men and women that have served. And I know personally, following along the Coast Guard's social media and everything that you post, as I've wanted to support you in your transition, I've learned so much as well. And do you find that people are becoming more receptive to all this knowledge that they never really knew? They're finding excitement in all this?
I think so. And I think, one of our first audiences that we really had to speak to were the members of the Coast Guard themselves. This has been a little bit of a long-held dream. I think the idea was first sort of rolled out in the early 2000s, but the effort to really build the museum didn't kick off until about 2015. And so there are some folks within the service who were skeptical as to whether we would ever reach the point we're at now. And so, first of all, we had to, convince them that we are for real. They, of course, understand why it's so important to tell these stories. But it's very exciting to take somebody who probably has a tangential connection to the Coast Guard, either because they live in a region where the service is particularly active, or they might have a family member who served or is currently serving. So they have a point of reference for the Coast Guard, but we're able to deepen that understanding and get them really excited to come see the museum when it is open.
And so, as you're unfolding and in this job, we're here to learn about that, but we're also here to learn about you and your journey here. And as it is stated, you did 19 years in the Salvation Army. You've helped start new ministries, so this starting something from the ground up isn't new for you. But for Drew Forster, with Director of Communications in different forms, where did that all begin? Where did you realize that you had a passion for telling the stories?
Well, I come from a long line of storytellers. My parents both grew up in Somerville, Massachusetts, and so right outside of Boston. And for all intents and purposes, anybody that doesn't live in Massachusetts, Somerville is Boston. It's right
Yeah.
over the line, right?
Although anywhere in Massachusetts, it's Boston once you left Massachusetts.
Well, yeah, inside 128, right?
Yes,
inside
exactly.
that loop, when people ask me where I'm from, I don't tell them I'm from Sharon, Massachusetts. Sometimes
Right.
I'll say a suburb between Boston and Providence, but the easy shorthand is I'm from Boston. But I think there's something about Bostonians, and especially the lineage I came from, where they are these tremendous storytellers, and so I feel like I always grew up around stories. My own father was a writer, and he was a Corps officer like you for 24 years, but he also wrote for Salvation Army publications during those times. And then the second half of my parents' Salvation Army career was really spent largely in that publications arena. My mother handling circulation of the magazines and things like that. She sort of had the business background, used to run the finances for the Corps. And so translating over to handling the data and all the mailing lists for national publications like the War Cry, which is the Salvation Army's publication for the United States. There's also one in Canada, and my father was both the assistant editor-in-chief and then eventually the editor-in-chief of both of those publications. And so I think I come by the passion for storytelling and for writing pretty honestly. But specifically the way it happened was I was working on a project called the Ray and Joan Kroc Core Community Center. Joan Kroc was the wife of McDonald's founder Ray Kroc, and she always had an appreciation for Salvation Army mission and ministry. And so during her lifetime, she actually gave $100 million to the Salvation Army to build a world-class community center in the Rolando Heights neighborhood of San Diego, which was a neighborhood that ordinarily wouldn't have access to, Olympic swimming pools and an ice skating rink and a theater and indoor and outdoor recreation spaces. That was actually a 12-acre campus, 5 buildings. She saw that building built. She saw it come to fruition. And so
we've heard it described as YMCA on steroids, like that
exactly.
premise. Yeah.
Yeah, and most Salvation Army buildings, and just from looking at your background there, I think Berwick probably is right there. Most of our buildings are humble. They would not win architectural awards. No. And if they didn't have the Salvation Army symbol on the outside, you might have to guess, is that a church? What is that? She wanted these buildings to really stand out in the community, and not because they were architectural marvels, but because of the impact they could have in the lives of children and families.
Right.
And so I was the first employee hired to kind of work on that campaign. That was a $115 million capital campaign. I wrote a blog post not long after I got that job of 10 phrases that I, hadn't ever used about a month prior, and now all of a sudden was. And $115 million was one of those phrases that I was using very frequently that was not part of my parlance.
No,
for that
you didn't see that many zeros very often. No, it did not happen.
No. And I was initially brought in as the planning coordinator. I held a couple of different titles during the 6 years of developing that project. And by the end of it, I was the program and development manager. But one of the things that happened with that project is we really wanted to make sure that we had community buy-in, and also that we were leveraging the community's own knowledge of what was most needed in that community. We did not want to build a community center that was going to have a bunch of programs and a bunch of offerings that weren't useful to the people in that 1 mile radius, which at the time was the most socioeconomic or economically challenged neighborhood in Boston. Socially and culturally, one of the richest neighborhoods in Boston.
Right.
But this was a community that did not have a lot. And so we didn't want to just bring something in a sort of, if you build it, they will come scenario. We really wanted to engage the community about what is most needed on the Dorchester-Roxbury line near Upham's Corner in Boston. And so we held over 200 community meetings for that project. And I think I was at 198 of them, right? And a lot of them took place in church basements and community spaces that we could get because we didn't have a presence right there on Dudley Street in Boston. And the leadership of the Salvation Army at the time liked the way that I presented the project. I tended to bring the project update in each of those meetings. And they kind of looked at, hey, Drew does a pretty good job with those updates. And so they decided to start to bring me into corporate boardrooms when they were pitching the project to potential donors, because the Kroc Trust supplied 85 million of the 115 million. We had to raise 30 million locally as a match to that. And so we were in this active capital campaign, even while we were in the campaign or the process of developing what was the building going to look like, what were the physical spaces going to be, and then what was the programming that we were projecting would go into those physical spaces. So all of that to say, I really started to tell the Salvation Army story to a variety of audiences. And I think what they were particularly impressed with, what the leadership was particularly impressed with, was how I was able to, give a similar presentation, but bring in that nuance, bring in the latest update, calibrate it to who was in the room, right? Because a good presentation is not just something you've practiced for 45 minutes at home. You also have to read the room that you're walking into. Right. And if it's mostly seniors, you don't want to gear your whole presentation toward programs for little kids, because there are some seniors who would rather not see the little ones, at their feet all the time. If you're walking into a room full of families, then you really want to emphasize the opportunities for kids to learn to swim in an indoor water park rather than a cold lap pool. They were going to be able to walk into this zero depth entry spot, and there would be things to play with in the water, and that was going to attract a lot more kids into that water. And so I was able to bring out the various opportunities the center was going to have, and I think that's really where I found the storytelling, to go beyond something I liked to do, sort of in my spare time, and really became more of a profession. And then after 6 years of all those community meetings and building this 90,000 square foot community center on a 6.5 acre campus, I had missed an awful lot of family dinners at home. And the communications role with the Salvation Army of Massachusetts opened up. And at that point, the state headquarters was the next town over from where I lived. So instead of commuting all the way into Boston every day, sometimes at 5 o'clock in the morning to open the center for the 6 o'clock swimmers and fitness types, I was able to work more of a sane schedule outside of the Christmas season, and be home with my family a lot more. And so that's really how the development from, I had been really engaged more with program prior to this job, and that's when I sort of shifted over toward that development focus. And I always said I had the best job. I got to tell all the good stories, and somebody else had to ask for the money. So I've enjoyed that aspect for the last last 10 years or so.
And, or in our case, you would tell me how to tell the story and then how to ask for the money while telling the story, because that's what we need to do as well. And
yeah, it all depends on the environment you're in, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Well, you kind of talked in your transition time about, you weren't sure about going to the Coast Guard Museum, telling that story. And it reminded me of a previous guest we had on here. It was a writer and a video game developer. He would develop the storylines. And he said something similar about, he was given a cheerleading game, and how would I tell this cheerleading story? And he said once he got into it, he just found the stories came to him. They're there. And so what would you say to someone who might be beginning to write, beginning to want to get into media, podcasting, but maybe their only entry point is something that maybe they're not 1000% in? What would you kind of say to those people as they're getting started in that?
Well, I think all good writers, presenters, podcasters, radio personalities that talk more than just doing sort of the waka 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 DJ, right? I think that in order to be in those roles, the most important skill is listening. And sometimes I think when I have kind of a big personality, right? And so sometimes we can be tempted to try to use our charisma or whatever to sell the story. But what I learned early when I got into that communications role was I needed to listen to make sure I had the story down, so that I could then, present it to a news source, or maybe do the interview myself if the scenario presented itself that way. It was really important to sort of listen to what was going on. And one of the things that frankly surprised me about telling the Salvation Army's story was that these folks were pastors, right? Salvation Army officers are ordained ministers. They preach a sermon every week, either them or their spouse. And so I felt like, well, these people will be natural storytellers, and they will know when the stories are happening, that we could translate into more awareness for their ministry in that particular community. I'll never forget being in a meeting, and a Corps officer shared a story in which a pregnant woman had come in the wintertime in Boston, 10 inches of snow on the ground outside, and she was wearing those like hospital shoes they give you, the little, slides they give you when you leave the hospital. And she walked in and asked the only person she could find at the time, who was a janitor. She was also a soldier of that corps, a member of that church. And she said, "Do you have any shoes?" And this woman walked around the building looking for shoes, couldn't find any. The way the Corps officer told the story to this table I was sitting at was, "Yeah, my janitor walked in. She was in her socks. And she said, do we have any of those stuffy socks that we gave out at the nursing home last time?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I think we have some, but why do you need them?" And she told him the story. she had given this woman her shoes off her feet because she was pregnant. It was snowy outside in Boston. And it never occurred to him to tell me that story. I said, if you had told me that story that day, I could have had TV crews in your building, like, telling this incredible story. And not to take advantage of this woman's awful situation that she would find herself in need to come to the Salvation Army, but that someone at the Salvation Army would be that selfless that her first instinct would be, well, I got to solve this problem. And he said, well, how did this come about? She said, well, Captain, I thought about what you would do. And that's when I looked down and I took my own shoes off and gave them to her. I mean, it was just the most incredible story. So in the listening, you often, discover those things. And I totally agree. The stories have always come to me. I have had to do very little seeking out of the stories. When it comes to the Coast Guard, I'm very fortunate. We have 230 plus years of Coast Guard history that I can mine. And because we are building a museum, it doesn't all have to be the latest drug bust, the latest, rescue that the Coast Guard has done. I'm able to draw on that history. Just today on our social media, we posted something that happened in 1820, I think. And it was a revenue cutter service vessel that captured a brig that had 127 slaves on. And this was, after the slave trade was illegal in the country, and the revenue cutter service, which was the original service that Alexander Hamilton founded, that later became the Coast Guard in 1915. But I'm able to draw from that history, and yet we're telling a story that still feels very, very relevant today. And really, the revenue cutter service was on that leading edge of preventing the illegal slave trade once it became illegal. So listening to history, right, and trying to dredge up those different resources. And again, the Coast Guard has this wonderful chronological timeline of all the things that have happened in Coast Guard history, but there are no images. That it's like a plain text kind of timeline. And not to pick on the historian's office, but as a museum and as the Museum Association, we tie into an image, or if there is a video for something that's happened, more in my lifetime, we'll tie those two things together and try to bring those stories to life.
And that's amazing to hear, those little nuggets. And, as you were telling even the story about the woman with her shoes and Captain, what would you do? I actually go back to something you told me early on, which was think of your own story. Like, think of the effect of your, like, did something similar happen to you? How, can you tie in? Because a lot of times it's that personal touch. How did it affect you? Even your reaction, that you can draw on in telling these bigger stories. And so you've got a plethora. I know that you probably could. I know we could probably do a podcast just on Coast Guard stories and Salvation Army stories. But I got to ask, you've used a lot of, going to hear a lot of terminology, big words and things in a job throughout that you've done. But I know that you've had some amazing experiences because of your position. Could you maybe tell us something, what are some of the coolest experiences that you've got to meet somebody, go somewhere you never thought would happen because of your experiences?
Well, I will start with a Coast Guard story and then go to a Salvation Army story, if that's all right. Last summer, I guess it was August, so almost a year to the date. I got to sail on the Coast Guard's tall ship. The Eagle is the only tall ship that is in, regular service. You have the USS Constitution, which is an asset of the Navy, and it occasionally sails, but it is a museum, kind of ship. The Eagle is an active vessel. It was actually part of the spoils of World War II, originally called the Horst vessel in Germany, and came from Germany, from the Nazis, to New London, Connecticut in 1946. And that vessel is actually going to be home ported at the front door of the National Coast Guard Museum. A year ago, I got to go for a sail on it from New London up to Portland, Maine with a couple of our board members. And it was during swab summer. So part of the experience of every cadet entering the Coast Guard Academy, which is also in New London, is that they sail in Eagle, and they get to learn about, you know, these ancient maritime traditions. They are out with a sextant shooting stars at night. That's this sort of weird compass-looking thing with a viewfinder in it, and that's how they used to get around before GPS was celestial navigation. You sailed by the stars, right? To make sure your course was good. But they're also out there. Somebody literally at the front of the line says heave, and everybody else behind him goes oh, and it's wild to be,
Wow.
you know, in the 2020s, you know, aboard this vessel. But the community, the sort of life aboard that vessel, the food, unbelievable on Eagle. They have some really fantastic culinary specialists aboard that vessel, and so that experience was definitely a once in a lifetime. I got to climb to the tops. They don't let visitors climb to the Royals anymore, which is all the way up the mast, but I did get to climb up 60 feet above the deck. And I think I'm grateful I did it when we were at anchor in Portland Harbor. It made the platform very stable for me to do that.
That's all you, brother. That's all you.
Well, the most amazing thing, Mike, is it's a free climb. You have a harness on, but it's a free climb. The rigging is sort of angled in, so I guess the premise would be if you slip, you're going to fall into the rigging. You're not going to fall overboard. But then you get to the top and you clip in your harness into this D-ring right at the very last moment as you're stepping up onto that platform. But I couldn't believe it when this, you know, when this seaman first class told me I was, you know, climbing up there without, I'm not attached to anything. That was pretty wild. And then in terms of the Salvation Army, we had something happen early in my time as the director of communications. We had an anonymous donor put a wedding set, her engagement ring and her wedding ring, in a Salvation Army kettle in Boston, and she attached the appraisal for those items, and it came to $1,800. She wrote this beautiful note that she was doing this in memory of her husband, and she had hoped that someone would give up to 10 times the value of the rings to support the Salvation Army.
Wow.
Well, luckily I found out about that one.
Yeah.
The TV stations got a hold of it, and I'll never forget when WCVB in Boston, Channel 5, somebody called me and said, so let us know how we can help you with auctioning off these rings. And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm just telling the story. I hadn't even thought about the fact that it's now going to be my department's responsibility to sort of figure out how do you auction off rings during the Christmas season. But the TV stations loved it. We had every outlet in Boston, you know, the Boston Globe, everybody was really into this story. And so I was personally taking the bids, and we actually had a widower. He had lost his wife, and he wanted to give us a significant amount of money. If I recall, it was around $15,000. He was the high bid, and he wanted to give the rings to his daughter. And I was so touched by the story and the generosity. So I was kind of rooting for that guy. And then this woman calls me and she says, I'll give you 5,000. I said, well, you know, we're at a higher number. And I was trying to be, you know, fair, but also, you know, deal with integrity with this woman. Anyway, we get up to 12,000. She says, look, what's the top bid? I'm going to outbid it, you know, and I'm feeling for this other guy. Long story short, she ended up giving us $20,000 for those rings. But she had a stipulation. She said, I want to return the rings to the original donor. I said, ma'am, we have no idea who did this. The person just slipped them into the kettle.
Yeah.
And so then this woman who knew a bell ringer, she was actually the corps officer, and you know her, Major Armida Lamar.
Yeah.
She was captain at the time, and they had developed a friendship. They had even exchanged some jewelry. I think Armida made jewelry, and these two were actually friends, and they would see each other in North Station on the commute every morning. Well, she walked up to her and said, wow, that is some story about the rings, right? And Armida was kind of distracted, and then she looks up, and tears are streaming down this woman's face. And she said, were those your rings? Did you do that? And she said, yes. And so on the 23rd of December, I was in the room when this widow who donated the $20,000 was able to hand the rings back to this widow who had originally donated them. And one of my favorite photos that I took in that role was their, 4 hands together with the rings in their hands. And to be in the room when those 2 women met. I mean, I have chills right now telling that story.
Yeah, goodness, man.
And then it started a trend. And on Christmas Eve that year, there were 10 different jewelry donations as people were sort of following the story in the news. And that carried on for several Christmases. And we would hold an annual auction of all of those items. And it just brought an awareness to the Red Kettle campaign. Obviously, people sort of see it. They're rushing by. They don't like the bells ringing or whatever. But it changed people's perspective enough that they would leave their home with jewelry in order to put it into the Red Kettle. And so that was a fantastic story. And to be able to keep telling that story every Christmas, whenever we had our first jewelry donation, that was going to be a big hit, media wise. And that was a really lovely story to tell.
And see that just, if those that are watching won't know, well, some will, that just shows how passionate Drew is about his roles, because I was for sure thinking you were going to say it was Salvation Army Day at Fenway Park, or standing, Red Kettles in Boston with so-and-so sports star, or, being at TD Gardens with the banners. No, you went to something that was a direct correlation to telling the story. And so that just shows where your heart really is. Well, Drew, I want to be cognizant of your time and respectful. So I want to finish by asking you the same question I ask all my guests. If Drew now could go back and tell 12-year-old Drew anything about the future, about your about, especially into your vocation, but go back and tell 12-year-old Drew anything, what would that be?
That is a really challenging question. I think I might tell him that it is okay to follow your passions into different areas in your career. One of the things that I didn't really realize until probably my 3rd position is that I've had a series of 4 to 5 year runs in the jobs I've taken. So in that 19 years I worked for the Salvation Army, I had 3 different sort of major chunk positions. I actually had another little one in the middle of all that, or a couple other little ones in the middle of all that. But I had these major positions that I did in those in about 5 to 6 year stints. Before that, I was a high school teacher for 4 years. So I think being prepared to take advantage of that next opportunity that comes along. Not being afraid to transition. And I have to say that, in middle age, after working for one company for 19 years, to take that risk of going somewhere else, that was something that I definitely needed to rely on the Lord and his will for my life to do that. So don't be afraid of the next adventure, I guess, would be, the advice I would give. And I've been incredibly blessed, and I have gotten to do a lot of cool things as a result of these positions I've been a part of. But for me, it's always about the connection to people. People are the most fascinating on earth to me. I always say that the stories I've gotten to tell, you couldn't possibly make up. You couldn't possibly write them in a novel. The true stories are always more amazing than that. And so I guess that would be my advice for 12-year-old Drew. Oh, and to enjoy your hair while you have it.
Hey, brother, you said it, not me. I'm just saying, I know I'm a ticking time bomb eventually. So, well, Drew, as we go out, do you want to go ahead and give a plug for, the Coast Guard Museum? And even if people wanted to, donate or get behind and learn more, where can they go?
Well, everything is at coastguardmuseum.org, and right there on the screen, that handle of @USCG Museum, that's where we are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can learn all about this 5-story museum. We like to say 5 decks, thousands of stories, and we hope to break ground next month. We are putting the planning stages together for August, I guess. We're still in June, but planning this summer.
By the time this airs, it'll be next month. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So breaking ground on this museum this summer in New London, Connecticut, and that's really exciting. If you're in the region, come on down and participate in that groundbreaking. It'll be all over those channels.
Oh, that's so great. I look forward to coming to see it when it's complete. You know, I can hit that and go see family in Maine. So it's a good trip, and go back to
Yeah, it's
Athol
very
for a
easy
day.
off of 95, Amtrak. The ferries to Long Island are right there. Yeah.
Yeah, so head on up. So, well, Drew, thank you so much for joining us, and remember to tune in every week for Get to Know. We got some really interesting guests coming up in the next couple of weeks, and don't forget to be checking our social media. There may be some contests coming up that regards to questions from these interviews, so make sure you keep looking. So until next week, I'm Captain Mike, and we'll see you later.
Thanks for having me.